Hi there, my name is Alexandra Doyle, and this video is part of my series on the bass clarinet in opera. So as you probably know by now, this is the big bass clarinet solo from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. So this happens in Act 2. Before we talk about the actual solo or the opera, we're going to talk about the notation. So this is something that young bass clarinetists struggle with just a little bit. This part is bass clef in A. So if you are kind of new to the bass clarinet and you've been tapped on the shoulder to play this part, that's probably the scariest thing about playing this opera, is reading bass clef and reading in A. So first things first, I would just practice reading in bass clef and practice reading in A and transposing before you try to put both of those together, because it is a little scary at first. It's also really important for you to know that in what's called German notation, so you'll see this a lot with Wagner and also with Strauss, anytime you have a part that's mostly in bass clef and then you'll have some little treble clef sections here and there, you're going to read those treble clef sections up an octave from where you would normally read them on the bass clarinet. So we don't have any of that in this particular excerpt, but it's important to keep in mind. If you see those spots in the opera, read them up an octave from normal, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the actual story of Tristan and Isolde. So it's very, very important anytime you're playing an opera to keep the plot in mind when you're preparing the excerpt. I mean, that's true with any music that has any kind of programmatic content, but in opera especially, because when you have a solo in an opera, you're playing a character or you're playing an idea or you're playing a character's inner feelings or something, but you have a character to play. You're not just playing music in the background. You are somebody, right? You have to have that in mind. So the tale of Tristan and Isolde is basically a Romeo and Juliet story. We're in the same ballpark as Romeo and Juliet. So there's true love and there's also bad news for everybody involved, right? So Tristan and King Mark are the absolute best of friends, right? Tristan is basically his like number one knight. And so he finally convinces King Mark to get married. He's like, you've been single for a long time. The kingdom needs an heir. You need to take a wife. And so finally Mark is like, okay, I guess you're right. Whatever. I'll get married to this girl Isolde. She sounds great. Can you go pick her up for me? If you know the tale of Rosencavalier, you know how this goes, right? So Tristan goes to get Isolde from her homeland and bring her back to King Mark so they can get married and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, when Tristan and Isolde see each other, they basically fall in love at first sight, and that's the end of the story. They try to do the right thing, but they are in true love, and so they can't resist each other, and they end up having an affair for a long time after Isolde's wedding to King Mark. So, of course, King Mark finds out because they're kind of obvious about it. And this big bass clarinet solo happens in the middle of King Mark's aria. So he is really mad and he's really heartbroken because he is actually in love with Isolde as well. And he is super hurt that she could betray him like this, but also with his best friend and the fact that his best friend would treat him like this. So he's lost his wife and his best friend basically in one fell swoop. And so his aria is equal parts anger and just really deep sadness. And so you are his inner feelings in this. During the whole solo, which is longer than the section I just played, but that's kind of if you were going to excerpt this for an audition, I would expect it would probably be basically that, maybe a little bit more. You're alternating with King Mark. He sings a little, you play a little, he sings a little, you play a little. Sometimes your entrances and exits overlap just a little bit. So if you're going to play this in an opera, I would go on and look at a score and mark his words in your part so you know exactly how you're supposed to line up together. Make sure you're listening for him, not the other way around, because he's the singer and you play in the orchestra and you know how that is. So make sure you know those things before you get started. It's also important to keep in mind that in an audition situation, You want to be very, very careful with your entrances for these first two phrases. So like a really nice, probably air start for the first one. Something really, really, really quiet, you know, is probably appropriate for an audition where they're going to be really listening to see if you start really quiet. But in the real orchestra, the whole orchestra plays a note on the downbeat there, and then they drop out and you're still playing. So really in the orchestra, you can just like, and like, whatever, right? Like no one's going to hear you. Everybody's playing right there. So it's a little bit different approach whether you're in an audition or in an orchestra, but that's always true, right? So you play this first phrase, leading to that second G flat, and then there's some singing here, right? Now, in this whole solo, you have really, really long phrases. It's important to always keep the motion going forward. Think about where you're going to, and then come away from there. But try not to create, like, don't do too much work making little tiny sub phrases in these because you can end up interrupting the longer phrase. Now, this second phrase that you have is really the biggest deal in this solo, I think. That's personal preference. Now, if you are a super awesome air control person, you can probably make this in one breath. I suffer from asthma. I am a person who breathes a lot in everything. I just can't make things in one breath normally. So I would take a breath in the second measure of this phrase after the G flat. So now, try to keep the phrase going as much as possible and take the breath as quickly as you can. Don't shape the end of the G flat, you know. That doesn't make any sense. Keep going through the breath as much as possible and make sure you hold out, like lean on the first note of this triplet a little bit too. So try to come away as much as possible in the second half there. Now, these solos especially, nothing else is happening in the orchestra. You're it. So you can take your sweet time with all of this. Really, you know, if you want to pull and push a little with the tempo, that's totally great. That'll make it a really effective performance. I would be careful not to do that too much in an audition situation because you don't want the committee to think that you can't keep time, right? So maybe a little bit of musicality here and there, but don't get so crazy with it that they're back there tapping a pencil and going like, is there a beat happening? You don't want them to question that, right? The rest of this is pretty much the same idea. Watch out for phrases in all of these, like make sure it's one long phrase, not too much funny business in the middle. Now, I've also marked in the annotated part that there's a link in the bottom of this video if you need it. I've marked the tutti and solo passages. So in the middle of this section, you have a bunch of measures with just some low whole notes. That's full orchestra. Like, you can honestly, I mean, you should play it, but like, you don't really need to. It's not a solo part, right? Now, after that, we have another one of these situations where the whole orchestra is playing and they drop out and you're once again playing a solo. So on the part that I've given you, this is in measure 20, where we have a breath mark and the orchestra leaves you there. So make sure that that note is really in tune and really steady so that when they drop out, you're not just like, right? So the orchestra comes back in here, and then same sort of thing. More orchestra. And that's another big solo at the end. Now, in an actual opera orchestra, I would do something fancy with those 16th notes, right? That's the first time that you've had those. This whole aria, you're just doing the same thing starting on different notes, right? So finally, when we have put a little pizzazz on it just to show that we have a different musical idea, and we're also resolving down to a different place. So really, I would try to get it like a meaty, full sound on that C. A lot of the stuff in this is marked piano, right? It's sort of distant. I would characterize King Mark as someone who doesn't like to let his emotions show sometimes. And so you are those emotions trying to break through. And I think maybe here they finally kind of do, right? We end up getting a little bit more of a nitty gritty sound in this section than what we've had previously. On the rest of these, like I said, we have the same idea over and over again. So I would think of ways to make them all a little different. Now, if you're starting at the very beginning and you're just doing those first two big phrases, I think it's very easy to do the second one a little louder, right? That's kind of the obvious choice. Start a little louder, get a little louder in the middle. But I would come up with a plan for how much you want each one to sound like the one before, or how it should sound a little different. This will also depend on what the singer is doing. If the singer is getting a little bit different sound quality or a little bit different articulation or something as the aria goes on, you should match what he's doing, right? He's the star of the show and you're just his little inner voice. So really tune into what that singer is doing. It's not a bad idea to ask the singer to have like a rehearsal with just the two of you and maybe a pianist or something if they need it, so you can really get close and hear what they're doing in this solo, because your parts are very, very closely tied together and you should do your best. I know sometimes it's hard from a pit to really hear what they're doing, but do your best to tune into what's happening on stage so that you can match. All right. This has been a brief explainer of the bass clarinet part from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. If you enjoyed this video, it's part of a larger project that you can find on my website on the bass clarinet in opera. So you just go to alexdoyleclarinet.com/operatic bass clarinet. And there are explanations on there with some videos and just a lot of writing and everything you could need to learn about some of these operatic bass clarinet parts. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much.